Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Lezak, Coordinator of Special Projects with the Adult Services Department. And on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Before we begin tonight's program, I would like to welcome Professor John N. Lau to give our land acknowledgement. John, I think we can hear you now.
You. Yes, it would help if I unmuted, wouldn't it? Yes. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. And here is a land acknowledgement that is, I think, appropriate for tonight. Chicago is situated on the lands of Potawatomi people. We were the stewards of this land and lived, loved, and cared for it until forced out by non-natives. Tribes who have historical relationships with the land in greater Chicago and northern Illinois through trade, travel, and habitation also include the Odawa, Ojibwe, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Miami, Mascoutin, Sac and Fox, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee, as well as mound builders and other tribes whose names have been lost as a result of genocide and ethnocide of European colonialism and the United States expansion. This land continues to be home to Indigenous people, and Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous populations in the United States. A land acknowledgement usually proceeds to discuss the therefore what. Every institution, organization, individual needs to think for themselves and reflect and come together with therefore what. I am thriving because I am on someone else's land. Therefore, what commitments, collaborations, etc. am I willing to make in response to, in recompense for, and in support of Native peoples? Thank you again.
Thank you so much for that, John. And thanks to all of you for joining us for Who's Lakefront, Chicago's unceded Native land. This event is part of the 2021 One Book, One Chicago season, exploring the theme Neighborhoods, Our City's Bedrock, and the book Bedrock Faith by Eric Charles May. Please visit onebookonechicago.org for other upcoming programs, reading recommendations, on-demand video content, and much more, coming now through the end of the year. Tonight's program is possible, and One Book, One Chicago is generously funded by donations to the Chicago Public Library Foundation. Visit cplfoundation.org for information on how you can get involved in their work. I also want to thank CPL's Native American Heritage Committee, who are co-sponsoring tonight's event, for helping to make tonight possible. During the program, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions from the audience for our Q&A following the conversation, so please feel free to ask one. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Ji-Yun Lee is an interdisciplinary artist, writer, and activist whose work explores issues of power, connection, and resistance. Her work has been shown in Chicago, Detroit, Santa Fe, Ohio, Missouri, and France. She has worked with social justice and community-based organizations for over 30 years in immigrant rights, economic justice, LGBTQ issues, and domestic violence. She holds an MFA in Fiber from Cranbrook Academy of Art, MA in Ethnic Studies from the University of California at Berkeley, and BA in Linguistics from Stanford University. John N. Lau is a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and an associate professor at The Ohio State University, where he also serves as director of the Newark Earthwork Center. John grew up in Southwest Michigan and lived for over 15 years in Chicago. He is currently involved in projects with the Field Museum of Natural History, the City of Chicago, the Chicago History Museum, and the MacArthur Foundation. He is the author of the recent book Imprints, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians and the City of Chicago. And he recently was a guest at CPL to discuss his book. Please check out the CPL YouTube page if you missed that wonderful event and watch it on demand. Madeline Wisa is the manager of tribal placement and development at Four Winds Casinos, where she focuses on helping tribal citizens obtain meaningful employment and work towards their professional and educational goals. A citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, she also serves Indigenous and other marginalized groups through her work with the American Indian Movement chapter of Indiana and Kentucky. In addition, she serves on the interim coordinating committee of the Michiana Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. Deborah Yepa-Papan is a visual artist with international acclaim in the field of contemporary Native American art, a co-founder of the newly formed Chicago-based Center for Native Futures, and the Native Community Engagement Coordinator at the Field Museum, where she welcomes Native American guests to the museum and facilitates their visits to collections. As an active member of the Chicago Native American community, she also serves as a liaison between the museum and the community, both locally and nationally. Through her artwork and her work at the Field Museum, she's committed to changing inaccurate representations of Native people and advocates for the inclusion of Native First voices and perspectives. Welcome to all of our panelists. Thanks so much for being here. First, let's begin with Ji Yun, who will share a bit about the background of the Who's Lakefront project. Please join me in welcoming Ji Yun.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to the Chicago Public Library and One Book, One Chicago for having us on tonight. 안녕하세요. 제 이름은 이지연입니다. I am an immigrant and of Korean descent. I wanted to talk a little bit about both this project, this public art project that I initiated, but also the larger issues that the project points towards. So I'll start with the origins of the project, which is Professor Lau and his book Imprints. And if you were on the September 9th talk, which you can still see on the website through the library that Jennifer mentioned, you can hear much more in depth about all of the chapters in the story of the relationship between his nation, Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, and the city of Chicago. I grew up in Chicago. I went to CPS. I also went to high school in the suburbs. And all of these stories, none of them I had heard about the relationship of his tribe and of Native peoples to the city of Chicago before I read his book. And one of the, next slide, please. One of the chapters in that book is about a lawsuit that the Pokagon Band filed against the city of Chicago in the early 1900s. And it went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And they made a very important argument, which Professor Lau talked about more in depth in his talk. And again, you can go listen to more of that in that video. But the basis for the lawsuit was that they were saying that in the treaties that they had signed, along with other members of some other tribes, that the land here was fundamentally Native. Next slide, please. And I always like to show this map by Kyle Malat, who is a language specialist with the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, which shows Potawatomi place names all around Lake Michigan. And you can see from the names that you can see the territory that Potawatomi folks lived in and stewarded and cared for, as John was saying. And in particular, you can see, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but Shekagoynak, where Chicago is now. And next slide, please. The Potawatomi, along with other Native folks, were forced off the land through 6 different treaties. But none of the treaties actually dealt with Lake Michigan itself. They only dealt with the land. And the treaty said that they would give up the land up to the shoreline of Lake Michigan. And then, next slide, please. Ever since settlers had come here, non-Native settlers had come to this area, they had started building land along the lakefront. Some of it was rubble from the Great Chicago Fire, and then over time, more deliberately, they used land from highway construction in other parts of the city, sand from the bottom of Lake Michigan, sand from Indiana. And now what we have all along the lakefront is over 5.5 square miles of lakefill, consisting of over 57 million cubic yards. And what the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi was saying back in that lawsuit was that all of that was unceded because the terms of the treaty had only ceded land up to the shoreline in 1833. So all of this so-called reclaimed land belonged to the Potawatomi and to other Native people, and that the city of Chicago should give the land back or pay for it. And obviously, as we can guess, the the Supreme Court ruled against the Potawatomi. So in downtown particularly, if you could go to the next slide, please, a very significant chunk of land. I'm guessing most of the viewers are in Chicago and you're familiar with Grant Park, Museum Campus, Soldier Field, Jackson Park, Streeterville. Almost all of that is landfill and therefore unceded territory. And as someone who had grown up in Chicago, the fact that I didn't know this really significant piece of information, I thought is wrong. It's disturbing, it's wrong, and people should know about it. So as an artist, I like to use art as a way to make people think and feel and understand how what we see in the present is really based on an inheritance of things have been laid out in the past. So I thought of something that seemed fairly simple. If you could go to the next slide, please, which is to draw a line along that boundary of what had been forced, the land that had been forced, and then the landfill that had been created. And so in downtown, the shoreline used to be along Michigan Avenue. And so Michigan Avenue functions as that boundary between of the unceded territory. And so this was a rendering from a couple of years ago. And I talked to Professor Lau about it, about what if we do this? What do you think? And if you could go to the next slide, please. As a non-Native person, it was really important to me that we make sure that this project didn't continue without having significant input and direction and vision of Native folks. I think that's a lot of our charge as Native people, is to really be able to listen to and follow the lead of Native people. And I was very honored to have the folks on this panel, as well as these other folks that you see listed here, spend a lot of time and heart and care to make this project go well. And I really wanted the project to function as a platform for Native voice and Native visibility. So we came up with the idea of drawing this line along the sidewalk of Michigan Avenue. And the route was, we ended up going from south to north, starting at Roosevelt, which lines up roughly with the Field Museum, where Deborah works and where Professor Lau is an advisor and curated an exhibit that's currently there. But also holds many Native ancestors and sacred objects. So starting from Roosevelt Road up to the Chicago River, just north of the river, which is the site where Kivihawa and her slightly more well-known husband, Jean-Paul DeSable, had their homestead, their farm and trading post, and on the way passing by Fort Dearborn. So the material that we ended up using for the line, if you could go to the next slide, is sand to mark what used to be a beach and sand dunes. So on October 2nd, if you could go to the next slide, I'll show some photos from the event. We had a procession led by these wonderful Pokagon women elders, along with Madeline, you can see all the way on the left there, and other Native folks from Chicago, and a lot of Native college students who were in town for a conference. And it really, if you could go to the next slide, we had somewhere between 100 and 150 people along the way, including over 35 people who volunteered. Next slide, please. And the sand, we had 1,600 pounds of sand that we laid out on the ground. If you could go to the next slide, please. As those of you in Chicago know, Michigan Avenue really is the heart of downtown. And one of the college students who attends Northwestern University wrote an article for the college newspaper afterwards and described participating in the project as a way of indigenizing Chicago's downtown. And next slide, please. And as I said, that route goes past Fort Dearborn, goes past more than one monuments and public art pieces that are very harmful to Native people. And so it was very important, I think, that we had a significant presence of Native people. Next slide, please. And where we ended, like I said, was right across, just north of the Chicago River, where we got to be in interaction with the public art piece by Andrea Carlson, and Ojibwe artist who was also part of the project planning committee. Her banners, if you can't see, it says, "You are on Potawatomi land," and there's a section to the left of it that says that in Potawatomi as well. So it's a really powerful statement and presence in downtown Chicago. Next slide, please. I was particularly happy to have, we had posters along the route to try and give people information and having the juxtaposition of the image from the test along with the reality. I love this photo. It makes me really happy. Next slide, please. And the line itself, that route is over a mile long, almost 1.5 miles. And to have it be a real object in real space in a real place was very powerful. I just have a couple more. Next slide, please. Photos of, this is us right at the beginning. And then next slide. And as we progressed, it's a little hard to see on this, but you can see the line as it's being created, stretching out behind the procession. And next slide, please. Yeah. So, yeah, it was I want to provide space for the others to talk about this, but if you want more information, we did create a website that has a lot of the background context about the Pokagon Band claim, as well as the treaties, the process of creating all that landfill, as well as much more information about both the Pokagon Band and other Native peoples, both in the past and in the present, who are in the Chicago area. So I will now pass it on to Professor Lau and Deborah and Madeline to share thoughts about the project, about the issues, I'll pass it over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jian. I think that you had asked if each of the panelists might sort of respond to with their experiences. So Professor Lau, do we want to start with you?
Oh, sure. Well, it was, as a Pokagon Potawatomi person, it was an honor to write that book in print of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi in the city of Chicago. But to be honest, it was an even greater honor for somebody to have read it. And obviously, Jian read it and took it to heart. And so I was really inspired that, they talk about teaching and writing as planting seeds, but to really see that that happen, first with Jian and with her incredible organizing skills and energy and charisma, really turn this into a vision, into a project, into a happening. I was really proud to be a small part of that.
Madeline, could you talk about what it was like to be on the committee or your highlights from your experience?
Bonjour, Madeline Wisa, Indigenous, Michigan, Dodem, Pokaganek, Bodrewadami, and Wazaki, and Dochbia. Hello, my name is Madeline, Pokagan Band. I'm Turtle Clan, and I live in St. Joseph, Michigan. I think after having taken some time to kind of discuss what this project meant to us as Indigenous people, and the word that kept coming up in conversation over and over again was representation. And I think that's something that a lot of people in this country take for granted. Others can turn on the TV and they can see themselves, and they can turn on the radio and they can hear themselves. They see themselves represented in shop windows and on billboards, and that's something that Indigenous people, we just don't have in this country. In order for this country to be successful, there was a very deliberate erasure of not just Indigenous identities and cultures and languages, but of Indigenous lives. And so to be able to walk down that mile-long stretch along Michigan Ave with a crowd of beautiful and strong and proud Indigenous people who were there taking up space unapologetically and forcing people to look at us, whether they wanted to or not, I think was a very powerful message that, the history of this country, it didn't begin with settler contact. Our people have been here for thousands of years, and we have a history and we have identities, and it's important that those things be acknowledged, not just for the sake of seeing us, but for the sake of creating a better future for our children and for the next 7 generations. So it was really an honor and a very powerful experience to be a part of.
Thank you. And Deborah, how about you? Your initial kind of response to being a part of this?
Hi, as Madeline and John both said, it was such an honor to be a part of this project. I will just, so kind of going to the beginning a little bit, I was a little skeptical about this project when, GN came, there was a meeting that I was at with some other Native community members. And I remember seeing GN there, and she, brought this project to us, and she described it, and she was talking about it, and she was talking about, what she was hoping to accomplish with it. And, as a Native artist and, representation of, Native people is something that's very important to me in both the artwork that I do and the work that I do professionally at the Field Museum. I'm very critical. And so, of course, I just, I was really just listening to what she was saying. What is this project that she's trying to do? Because, we're also of that mindset of, as Native people, you can't do anything about us without us. And so, GN, not pretending to be Native, she's a proud Korean woman, she knows she's not Native, but she's, had the courage to come into, the space to share this project with us. I thought, that was really impressive to me to start. I was really impressed that, here's this non-Native woman who wants to share and tell this important story and history. And she's coming to us, and she's asking us not to just check off a box to say, oh, I spoke to some Native people for their approval. But, she welcomed our feedback. She welcomed, our thoughts. She wanted us to look at this critically. She wanted us to really, dive deep into this and really get, to the heart of, what is this project and why is it important? And why should Native people be involved? And I think that's a really important example to set as a non-Native person doing anything that has Native content, or trying to tell, trying to help change the narrative and tell the narrative from an Indigenous perspective. You cannot do that without Native people. And so, and for GN to also just really, share that platform and really help to prioritize and privilege Native voices, particularly Potawatomi voices, I think is just, that to me, is the reason why I'm just like, I'm so proud of this project and so proud to be a part of it, and to be a part of this kind of, homecoming for Potawatomi people. You know, at the event especially, and you know, to have like this you know, delegation of Potawatomi people, strong Potawatomi women. You know, a lot of our societies, a lot of our cultures are matriarchal. And so to have, you know, this great number of Potawatomi women leading the procession was just so beautiful. And then some of us were, you know, we were on the tail end. So we were, you know, we had your backs. We were all the way in the back, holding it down back there. And you know, it was just such a beautiful event, and you know, there's everything positive about it. And I really, really hope that people that were passing by, that were watching the procession, you know, went away wanting to know more about what it was about, wanting to know more about, you know, Chicago, and that Chicago was already this incredible kind of, you know, metropolis in a way, I guess, right? I mean, because there were people that were already living here and created, you know, they created this foundation. Yeah, so, you know, I like to say, so my land acknowledgement is Chicago was Chicago before it was Chicago, if that makes any sense. So, you know, I hope that this is an education that I hope goes further, and I hope gets into Chicago public schools and other, you know, curriculum around the city and around the state, actually, because like Gian said earlier, it's not something I grew up learning. You know, we had to learn this on our own, but hopefully now it's something that can become a part of the fabric of education here. So, and thank you, Gian.
Great. So I wondered if anyone would like to respond. How does a project like this impact Potawatomi people who don't live in the Chicago area? And that's you, John. So I don't know if you want to start with that.
Oh, sure. I always have an opinion on something. How did it affect people back home? Well, it affected me because I got to meet some Potawatomi people, Pokagon tribal nation members that I didn't know really very well before, including Madeline Weesaw and Billy Warren and Jefferson Ballou IV and others. And so that was really good. But I think it also sparked some conversation, I know, among elders back home on the Traditions and Repatriation Committee for the nation. And it was coming up in conversations there. And I suspect that elsewhere too. And that's good. That was one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was that when I hear about how, you know, others say that they grew up in Chicago and they never heard of this, it doesn't surprise me, but I have to say that I grew up hearing these stories. You know, I remember from my earliest youth hearing about how, you know, we used to own, Chicago used to be our land, our ancestral lands, and they stole it away from us, and the lawsuit. And so I was glad to share this, make sure that people within the community and outside the community don't forget the story.
Thank you. Would anyone else kind of want to speak to that? Madeline, perhaps?
Yeah. So when we speak about Indigenous people and Potawatomi people in particular outside of Chicago, what I think I would really like to touch on here is that there's this whole concept of us not being from there, so we don't have a right to have an opinion because we're not in Chicago right now. It's a very colonial mindset. And we Indigenous people, we have always existed in these spaces, and our ancestors have always moved freely about in these spaces, and we don't have to hold ourselves accountable to colonial borders, and we don't have to silence ourselves or make ourselves appear smaller to make other people feel more comfortable with our presence. And so I think it was very powerful to be able to be in that place and to exist in that place the same way that our ancestors did, and not have to take into account how uncomfy it might make other people feel. And I think that that's something that more people need to be more aware of going forward is to be careful not to try to limit or silence Indigenous voices just because they exist outside of a space that you feel is appropriate for us to exist.
Great. The next question is, how does a project like this impact Native people of all tribes who live in the Chicago area or beyond? Deborah, you want to start off on that one?
Yeah. Just kind of, going off of what Madeline said about, I think as Native people, so I'm Jemez Pueblo, and, my people are in New Mexico in the Southwest, but I grew up here in Chicago. And, I think not until I started, learning about land acknowledgements and then making my own, I have to acknowledge myself and, my placement here. I think land acknowledgements, making land acknowledgements is a lot about, positioning your own self and sharing where you're from, and also acknowledging that, because I'm not Potawatomi, I'm not Ojibwe, I'm not Menominee, I'm not Ho-Chunk, I'm Pueblo, I'm a guest here. So I'm a guest on this land here, just as, my Potawatomi brother and sister here, if they came down to New Mexico, they would be guests down there. They would be our welcomed guests down there. And so I think, as Native people that are not, that these are not our ancestral homelands here for us, we have to be aware of that. And we also have to make sure that we're not displacing our brothers and sisters. And so I think it's really important. And one of the things that I try to advocate for, and as what Madeline was saying, we're not only should we consider and think about, Chicago based, but also Chicago displaced. And that would be, those folks that were removed from here. They had no choice in that. And this is still their ancestral homeland. And so, they have every right to have their voices heard and prioritized. And so, we as guests, Native guests, we have to help in making sure that their voices are heard.
That's great. John or Madeline, do you have anything to add about sort of the impact of something like this on Native communities across the country?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity for people from a lot of different Native backgrounds. There's over in representing in Chicago now, I think there's people from over 140 tribes within Greater Chicago. And it's an opportunity for all of us to come together, because justice denied to some of us is justice denied to all of us. And we can see that in strength there's numbers, and we can be allies together and support each other. And that's what this really opens the door for, and is a great example for, is what we can accomplish if we work together, both Native and non-Native.
That's great. Ji-Yun, I wonder if you would want to take this one. What effect do you think an art project can have in the quote unquote real world?
Well, I think that art can point the way to new ways of thinking about things that we take for granted. And that's what I hoped that this project could do, is that it would make people stop and think about what land we're on and whose lands we're on. And I think that art can be, once people have just that inkling of a different way of thinking in their heads, that can be an opening for things like policy changes, for things like changes to legislation, and for people to organize. I think part of what I saw happening during the procession was there was a lot of talking. People were chatting, And by creating this opportunity for people with shared interests and values to get together and make these connections, I think when we're fighting against something that is so taken for granted as the status quo, you need connections. You need a way to look to each other to have hope and get encouragement that yes, what we think is true, yes, what we think is right, and yes, it makes sense to do something about it. And so those, I think, art projects like this that can help bring people together, I think are really important for that aspect too. Also, in the process of organizing this, it did mean going up against a lot of bureaucracy in the city government. We got our permit approved the day before the event. And the process of making that happen included also trying to get letters of support from major institutions of cultural institutions and higher ed institutions along the route as a way to show that there was community support for this project. And those conversations were really interesting. A lot of institutions are grappling with not only how to craft a land acknowledgement, but really many people are trying to think about how to go beyond a land acknowledgement. And so for us to come with a very specific proposal for what institutions could do, there's many internal barriers to change in any institution. And to come into those institutions with a proposal for something specific for an institution to sort of grapple with, I think, even if they didn't end up writing a letter of support, having those internal conversations, I think, could eventually lead to we hope, could eventually lead to change. So just the fact that this was a project taking place in civic space meant having real world conversations about what institutions are willing or not willing to do.
That's great. And I should say that the Chicago Public Library was proud to support the project and host tonight, as well as some other related programs. How do we move from projects like this to decolonization and land back? I don't know who wants to start us off with that one. Madeline?
Yeah, so I think projects like this are the first step in moving towards decolonization and contributing to the land back movement, in that education is the most important part. Growing up as an Indigenous person in this country, one thing that I have noticed is that the history of this land is only taught from the perspective of the colonizers. We learn all about how Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and we learn about, the Pilgrims and the Indians and the first Thanksgiving and how wonderful and beautiful all that was. But the reality of those situations is actually a lot different. Everywhere that you walk, every time you step out your door, everything that you have in this country was bought and paid for with the lives of Indigenous people. And that's a really difficult and a really dark reality. And I think it's one that a lot of people don't want to face. And I think when we have these discussions, people sometimes feel guilt, maybe, or as if we are trying to force them to feel guilt. But what we're really trying to do is make sure that people know what happened and to reclaim our identity and our place in these lands so that we can move forward. And words like decolonization and land back are a little bit scary, because from a colonized perspective, these things mean taking everything back for ourselves and kicking everyone else out and not sharing these spaces. But Indigenous people, we don't think like that. So for us, when we talk about decolonization and land back, what we're really talking about is a return of this land to the stewardship of Indigenous people, and trusting that we know what's best for us, and we know what is best for this land. We've been here taking care of it for thousands of years, and it's a space that we can all occupy. But if we're going to do that, we have to work together. And the first step in that is learning and education.
Great. Does anybody else want to kind of respond to that?
Well, I just Two things. One is that I wanted to tell the story about the lawsuit for the Chicago Lakefront because I wanted folks to know that hashtag laying back didn't start in 2017. You know, it was in 1917 and before that we've always been fighting for laying back and that we should honor our elders for their wisdom in doing that. And, you know, I say miigwech and Egwean and Moena to my elders who sued for the Chicago Lakefront. I did not write the article in a law review or a legal treatise with the idea that it would prompt further lawsuits. I wrote it to preserve the story and to perhaps compel, you know, a moral and ethical argument for in consideration for more inclusive Indigenous voices in the affairs of Chicago and elsewhere. And so I think it's been useful in that regard. And I think that knowing about our Indigenous connections to the past is just the first baby step in a long, long process of healing and truth and reconciliation. And those are things that I look for more than decolonization or post-colonial. I'm not sure what those terms mean, you know, in the sense of I don't know that we'll ever get to a post-colonial world or decolonized world, but we can get to the point of truth and reconciliation and healing. I believe that we can do that. And I think this project was a beginning of more things to come.
That's great. We have so many great questions coming in the chat, so I want to make sure that I have time to get to them. So first one is, what sort of institutional support or approval did you seek out, and how did you decide whether or not to seek that official support, given that this was technically a protest?
I don't know that we would call this a protest. We did think about whether or not to get official approval from the city, but given that we were going to be including families and elders and young people, it made sense to do that. And so the largest institution was the city government, which has many departments. And so there was definitely a process of seeking what we needed from the various departments involved. And I do want to thank all of the workers in those city departments who did their best to try to facilitate the process, understand the project, support it in whatever ways that they could. I imagine it's not easy to work for the city. And so they're in a difficult position. So I want to thank them for that. And then, the other cultural institutions and colleges and universities were the primary other institutions that we went to for support. Many of them are located either on the unceded territory and along Michigan Avenue. So the Art Institute, the Cultural Center, the School of the Art Institute, Columbia College Chicago, Roosevelt University, Northwestern, the Field Museum, all of the other museums and museum campus. There's a fair number. Yeah.
Someone has asked, is this project finished, or is there a next step to continue it, or is there a different new project in the works? I am guessing, because we have several artists here on the panel and an author and professor, there's always new projects in the works, right?
Yeah, we had a debrief sort of meeting last week, and I don't know that we have specific ideas for a new project. I think all of us are walking away with different thoughts for what we'd like to see, and we'll see what happens. I don't know if others of you have specific things you want to talk about there.
Well, just briefly, I'll mention along with, I'm hoping that we keep our team together and that we do further projects. I've never really been involved in art and activism before, but I found it very inspiring and very nourishing. I'm also writing an article that I'm going to submit probably to the Chicago History Magazine, explaining why there's the argument that Chicago is Potawatomi ancestral lands. And so I want to, if we can get that published, then we'd be able to share that with the public, right? So I'm looking forward to that too.
That's great. Deborah, you must have some projects in the works as an artist, right?
I mean, I do personally. I think like with Center for Native Futures, I think, which is, a center that we're hoping becomes the epicenter of Native art here in the Midwest. We really want to support Native artists because I think part of the problem and part of the challenge in I guess decolonization, and I agree with John, it's not something that can happen ever. I think I mean, there is a way that it can happen, but I don't think that's how it's going to happen. But anyway, I'll let people try to imagine what that may be. But part of the challenge is accurate and appropriate representation of Native people, and just having people understand that, we're right here. We're not invisible. We have a presence, but I think we're part of the challenge is countering all those stereotypical images that just are all over the city, in some of those monuments and sculptures that we walked by right during the procession, and just in so many in murals and paintings everywhere in buildings that we probably have never even walked into and are so unaware of. But that's the first image of Native people that non-Native people see, and so that's why they can't see us because we don't look like those stereotypes. So that's a huge challenge, and I think having done this project hopefully brought that to it showed people like, look at these Indigenous people walking up the street creating this line and saying like, look, this is our homeland, this is we're here. We may have been displaced, but we're back. we're here. And I really think that art is a catalyst for change. I think art is a universal language. And I think that is, that's why it can help to change, because it's something that people can see, and visually you can connect with what's going on, with what you're seeing in front of you. So hopefully, I agree with John. I mean, I think this group was such an amazing group to work with that I hope that we can come back together again and think about other projects that we can work on and keep moving forward. But I think that, we also have so many other personal projects too that have, are kind of just kind of taking that capacity, taking up that time and space. But hopefully we can come together, and hopefully people will ask for more.
Great. We have some great questions coming through. The next one is, do reps from the 140 tribes in the Chicago area ever come together, or are they organized in any way? John, you're shaking your head no.
No, I was just actually, the cat had jumped on my lap and I was shaking my head. Yes, absolutely. They do come together. They come together through a myriad of organizations. The Chicago American Indian Center is just one of many examples, but an important example of how people come together in the Chicago area. There's a consortium on American Indian centers and organizations too that facilitates the organization and the mutual support amongst all of these American Indian communities. So yeah, when I lived in Chicago, what I noted was that people identify not only with their tribal background, but also that they are Chicago urban American Indian person, and they're proud of being a member of that Chicago urban Indian community.
Great. This is, of course, a great question coming from a library patron. What books or TV movies would you recommend to people wanting to learn more about Native Americans? Anybody have any favorite books or movies or TV shows to share?
Well, I love the documentary series We Shall Remain. It's a very good sort of series of documentaries about after the Mayflower all the way to the Red Power movement and everything in between, or a lot in between. Very good actors, very good production values, very interesting. I use it in my classes all the time. Most recently on TV, I have been watching Reservation Dogs on Hulu FX, which has been an absolute joy to watch. And for reading about Indians, I would mention that if you buy a copy of my book, I do get 10 cents from the sale of every copy. So, go.
Madeline, do you have any favorite movies, TV, books that you would recommend to folks wanting to learn more?
Yeah, so one that I'm reading right now is actually called The Inconvenient Indian. There's also an Indigenous author named Angeline Booley who wrote The Firekeeper's Daughter, which it was on the New York Times bestseller list. And the reason it's fiction, but the reason that I recommend this is because she uses our Indigenous languages a lot in the book and incorporates a lot of our culture. And along the lines of, the Res Dog show, it's one of the first times that any of us have ever seen ourselves accurately and meaningfully portrayed in really any space. So if you're looking to kind of connect with our culture in a way that is a little more entertaining, those would be my recommendations.
That's great. And Deborah, how about you? What would you recommend?
I wish I had time to read. With work and so many other projects, I don't, sadly, but I do agree Reservation Dogs is, that is, I think there might be some things that non-Native people will not understand because, they're just parts of our, everyday culture as Native people. But that's okay. I think, immersing, it's a good way to immerse yourself as a non-Native person in, a Native community, for example, and to learn from. I'm really big about learning from Native people as opposed to learning about Native people because, we're humans, we're fellow human beings, we're not objects to learn about. But so I would definitely look for, there's so many wonderful Native authors right now, and just, whose books I would definitely just look for and read. I think it's a great time right now for Native authors that it just feels like there's an abundance. I'm just sorry I can't name any off the top of my head right now, but there's a lot of Native poets too, a lot of Native creative writers, and that way I think is a good way to just kind of immerse yourself in Native culture.
That's great. Yeah, and I should also mention that most of the things that we just referenced here are available at your Chicago Public Library branch. So do check out the website and put those things on hold. We'll also, of course, have many recommendations coming during the month of November of hot books, movie, and TVs. I think we have time for one more question, which is a good one. What suggestions do you have for people who would like to be allies? Are there good local organizations to support or other actions you recommend to be taken?
If it's okay with the group, I'll kind of start with this one. So that's definitely my space as an Indigenous activist. This is what I do all day. So groups that I'm directly affiliated with are, of course, the American Indian Movement, chapter of Indiana and Kentucky. There's also the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which does a great job of centering and amplifying Indigenous voices in all of their spaces. Regardless, there's the Great Red Nation is also another wonderful group. But regardless of whichever group or place that you go learn more and to try and be helpful. Just make sure that those spaces are first and foremost centering our voices, because I think we tend to get caught up in, well, this group is progressive and this group is moving in the right direction, so this must be a safe place. And even though these spaces sometimes mean well, if you are failing to center Indigenous voices, then you're just colonizing us all over again in the name of progress. So when you're doing your research and you're trying to find places to go to find out how you can help, make sure that you're asking, what do they do for Indigenous people and how do they amplify our voices?
Deborah, I wonder if you might answer that and also just say a few words about the work that you do at the museum as well.
Oh, that's always a hard question for me to answer. I agree with Madeline. I think what she suggested is great. Because I like to, I just have a hard time answering that question. I feel like, somebody has to you have to do the research in what the best ways are. We can't always give you the answer. You have to go out and find that answer. But, going to a Native community center, volunteering, helping out, if they give you a broom to sweep up, then you sweep up. But also know that, you're not always going to be welcomed into a community in that way. And that, but that's okay. That's up to that community to decide whether, they want you there or not. But there are so many other ways that you can help too. I mean, there's so many organizations that, they have push that donation button, send some money to help some organizations out. And do your job in educating yourself as much as possible, about, our causes, our concerns, our, just make yourself more aware of how we might need you and where you could, find that way to help us. Again, it's just such a struggle for me to answer that question. And, I get that question a lot at the Field Museum as well when people come. But, I prioritize I prioritize Native people, and I hold myself accountable to Native people. And that's what's important to me in the work that I do. So, yeah.
Thank you. And John, do you have any thoughts about how people can be better allies or organizations you would recommend that are supported?
Yeah, it's a great question too, because we're only 1.5% of the population, so we don't have electoral power to get much done. We need alliances with other like-minded people that are seeking justice also. I go on to social platforms, the Association on American Indian Affairs. I came across them and got involved with them through LinkedIn. Doing research, you can either do local, regional, national, but as others have said, you may not always be welcome, but oftentimes you will be. And I would encourage people to reach out and research and reach out, and we'd gladly welcome you where I'm from anyway.
That's great. Well, thank you all so much. We had so many great questions, and I know we didn't get to all of them, so I am sorry for our commenters who are still asking questions, but do pick up John's book if you want to learn more specifically about the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and the history of their struggle in Chicago. And also keep in mind that there are many programs coming up. So that's all the time we have for tonight, but I want to thank Jian Li, John Lau, Madeline Wisaw, Deborah Yapa-Papan for being here with us tonight. Thanks to CPL Tech Leland Mosley for producing tonight's event, and thanks to all of you for being here. Special thanks to CPL's Native American Heritage Committee for their work in making tonight's event possible. And I want to make sure you do please check out the CPL website for many events coming in November, specifically for Native American Heritage Month, as well as throughout the year as we celebrate Chicago's diverse communities. I want to mention two of those events with two wonderful panelists we've just heard from. So Tuesday, November 9th, we have Walking in Two Worlds, Growing Up Indigenous in Turtle Island with Madeline. And on Monday, November 15th, Representation Matters with Deborah. So if you've enjoyed what they had to say tonight, you're going to like those programs. Make sure you go on the CPL website to register for those. Please visit onebookonechicago.org for information on upcoming events around our themed neighborhoods, our city's bedrock, including book discussions, films, author events, art programs, and more. Also visit the CPL YouTube and Facebook pages for on-demand video content, including from tonight's program. So if you had a friend who missed it, send them the link afterwards and they can watch on demand. We also want to mention that the website for this project is whoslakefront.com. You can also go to facebook.com/whoslakefront. So thanks everyone for being here and have a great week, everyone.